By the time the mourners gathered for Richard Burton's funeral, the noise that had trailed him his entire life had finally gone quiet. No flashbulbs, no reporters shouting from behind velvet ropes, no fresh scandal waiting in tomorrow's papers. Just a small church, a handful of old friends, and a silence that felt strange around a man who had spent decades impossible to ignore. And yet, in that silence, one conversation kept repeating itself among the people who had known him best. It wasn't about the Academy Award nominations. It wasn't about the Shakespeare, the fame, or the whiskey-soaked stories that had followed him from London stages to Hollywood sets. It was about a woman. The same woman whose name had been tied to his for most of his adult life. Long after the marriage certificates had been signed. And long after they'd been torn apart. It was almost as if every road Richard Burton ever walked eventually curved back toward her. For most of his life, Burton avoided talking about love in public. He discussed politics, drink, Shakespeare, almost anything, but the moment a question turned personal, his answers shrank. Those who knew him understood why. Some things are too complicated to explain to a world that already believes it knows the ending. The world loves a scandal far more than it loves the truth. What tabloids called an affair, Burton experienced as something closer to a collision, the kind that reshapes a person permanently. What millions dismissed as just another Hollywood romance became, for him, the central relationship of his life. In his later years, people noticed something shift in him. The old anger, the kind that used to flare up in interviews, had mostly burned itself out. What remained was quieter, not forgiveness exactly, but something close to acceptance. He talked less about triumphs and more about the people who had walked through his life and left something behind. 5 women, in particular, kept surfacing in those late conversations. One believed in him before the world had any reason to. One tried to help him rebuild after devastation. One arrived at a moment when he was desperate to convince himself he'd moved on. One brought him something close to peace near the end. And one never really left, no matter how many years or marriages came between them. Friends said a particular look crossed Burton's face whenever her name came up. Not the spark of young romance, something heavier. The look of a man remembering not just the love of his life, but the different life he sometimes wondered if he should have chosen. Tonight, we're going through all 5 women who shaped Richard Burton, the actress who knew him before fame, the woman who tried to give him peace, the wife caught in someone else's shadow, the royal friendship the tabloids couldn't stop inventing stories about, and finally, the one relationship that outlasted 2 marriages, 2 divorces, and everything in between. Stick with us until the end, because the final answer might not be the one you expect. Before Richard Burton was Richard Burton, before the knighthood talk, before Hollywood, before his face was recognizable in every country on earth, he was a broke, ambitious Welsh actor trying to get noticed on British stages in the late 1940s. That's where he met Sybil Williams, a fellow actress who saw something in him long before anyone else did. They were both hungry, both talented, both scraping by on small parts and smaller paychecks. Sybil didn't fall for a star. She fell for a shy, book-obsessed young man who worried he'd never be taken seriously by London's theater elite. She saw the real Burton before the persona was built. When they married in 1949, it gave Burton something he'd never really had: stability. As his career started to climb, first in theater, then film, Sybil was there through every audition, every setback, every small win. They had 2 daughters together. People who knew them in those years often said Richard seemed happiest the moment he walked back through his own front door, away from the crowds. It was a modest life, but for a while, it was enough. Then Hollywood came calling, and everything Burton had built quietly started to crack. Bigger films meant longer separations. Worldwide fame meant constant press attention, constant temptation, constant distance. The man who had once belonged almost entirely to his wife and daughters now belonged, in some strange way, to the public. And then came the film that changed everything, a massive historical epic that put Burton across from a woman whose fame dwarfed even his own. What started as on-set chemistry turned into a story too big for either of them to control. Every glance between them became a headline. Every rumor became confirmed by someone. For Sybil, watching from the outside, it was devastating. More than a decade of marriage, unraveling in real time, in newspapers. In front of the entire world, Burton rarely spoke about this period publicly in later years. But people close to him believed he carried real guilt over it. Sybil had stood beside him before any of the fame existed. She'd known the version of him that nobody else got to know. And in the end, she became the first casualty of a love story that was about to consume the rest of his life. By the time Richard Burton met Susan Hunt, the wild years were mostly behind him. He'd already lived through the highest highs Hollywood could offer, survived scandals that would have ended most careers twice over, and endured the exhausting cycle of loving and losing the one woman the entire world assumed was his destiny. The fire that once defined him had started to burn lower. What he wanted now was quiet. People around him noticed the exhaustion. Years of headlines, drinking, and being public property had worn him down. Susan offered something completely different from the chaos he'd grown used to. She was composed, private, and refreshingly uninterested in the glamour that usually surrounded him. She was drawn to the man, not the myth. Their time together looked nothing like his previous relationships. No wild parties, no press chasing them across continents. For maybe the first time in decades, Burton had something that existed away from public fascination, a relationship that didn't need an audience. They married in the early 1980s. And for those watching from the outside, it looked like Burton might finally have found something lasting. His health, by then, had taken a visible toll. Years of hard living had left their mark, and he understood better than most that time wasn't guaranteed. Susan became a calming presence in those final years, encouraging him to slow down, to actually enjoy the life he'd built instead of just surviving it. People who visited them described a home that felt warm, settled, mutually respectful. Burton seemed genuinely thankful to have someone who didn't need him to relive his past every day, but one name never fully disappeared from the room. Occasionally it would come up in an interview. Sometimes an old friend would mention a memory from years earlier. And whenever it did, something in Burton's face would change, not anger, just a pause. Like his mind had briefly stepped into another decade entirely. Susan understood something most people never allowed themselves to admit. Some memories don't get replaced. She never tried competing with a ghost. She simply loved the man in front of her instead of the headline version the world had spent decades constructing. That quiet acceptance may have been the most generous thing she ever gave him, even with the calm she brought into his life. Certain feelings stayed untouched by time, proof of just how difficult it was for Burton to ever fully close that earlier chapter. When Richard Burton married Suzy Miller, plenty of people assumed he was finally ready to move past the most turbulent stretch of his life. His marriage to the era's most famous actress had ended for a second time. The emotional whiplash seemed finally over, and Burton himself talked like a man ready for a clean start. Suzy was sharp, well-connected, comfortable inside London's social scene. She represented a future not constantly overshadowed by the most talked-about romance in film history. For a while, Burton genuinely believed this was the fresh start he needed. But almost immediately, an invisible weight settled over the marriage. Wherever they went, comparisons followed like a second couple nobody could see. Reporters didn't ask how the newlyweds were adjusting, they asked how his ex-wife felt about the wedding. Magazine covers kept pairing Burton's name with hers instead of his new wife, single quotes no matter how sincerely Burton tried to build something new. The public wouldn't let him step out of his own history. Friends recalled him seeming genuinely conflicted during this stretch. He cared about Suzy. He wanted it to work. But there were stretches where he seemed somewhere else entirely, not because of anything she'd done, but because he was still carrying weight he hadn't set down. Love that consuming doesn't just switch off because a marriage certificate says it should. Burton, of all people, knew that better than anyone alive. The strain built slowly and then all at once. Small disagreements turned into bigger ones. Every interview reopened the same old wound. Instead of giving Burton room to reinvent himself, The marriage became just another subplot in the public's obsession with the woman they were convinced was his real story. Looking back, people close to Burton didn't see this marriage as a fight between two people who'd stopped loving each other. They saw it as a fight between the present and a past that simply refused to loosen its grip. Burton rarely said anything critical of Suzy afterward. If anything, there was regret that she'd been pulled into a story that had started long before she ever entered the picture. Eventually, it ended.